على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. See where everybody is. Okay, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya Rabb. Okay, so today, inshallah, we were looking at why verses and chapters of the Quran were revealed and the Sunnah. So last week we spoke about Meccan and Medina surahs. And so we know that the Quran was revealed at different stages. And some surahs were revealed in Mecca and some revealed in the Meccan period and some after the Meccan, in the Medinan period. And we know that there are differences, there are some observable differences between these different types of surahs and ayahs. There's often an observable difference. So you want to look more generally about when and why verses and chapters were revealed, and then a quick review of the Sunan and Hadith as well. So first of all, any questions from last week? No questions from last week? Okay. So we want to look at what we call, why and when verses are revealed. So what is the definition of what we call asbab and nuzul? Asbab and nuzul, which can be very roughly translated as the reason why verses were revealed, the surahs were revealed. Okay. It's some of the works, significance, where verses were verses revealed more than once, and some modern abuses. Right, so here's an example of what we're talking about. So Ka'b ibn Ujra, this is in Bukhari and Muslim, he was plagued by lice while he was on Hajj. And the Prophet ﷺ told him to shave his head, and the verse was revealed, and then an expiation of fasting, charity, or sacrifice. In Baqarah 196. So why was Baqarah 196 revealed? Oh, because Ka'b ibn Ujra was on Hajj, and he had lice on his head, as he needed to shave his hair, and so they asked, well, what can you do when you're on Hajj and there's a difficulty? Can you shave your hair? And he said, yes, you can. And he said, it was revealed concerning me specifically. It was revealed concerning me specifically. Why did it? When did it come? When I asked that question to the Prophet ﷺ, that's when that revelation came. And what does he say? And it applies to all of you generally. So notice the very specific scenario that comes in is someone on Hajj with lice and they need to shave their head. And it says, and then an expiation of fasting, charity, or sacrifice. Meaning, if you need to shave your head for some reason, or if you decide to shave your head anyway, or if you accidentally shave your head, or etc., then you have to fast, or give charity, or sacrifice. Okay, so it applies more generally than an individual man, individual scenario, but it applies generally based on the wording. Right? So this is what we call asbab al-nuzul. And asbab al-nuzul, if we look at it from a very linguistic point of view, we understand it it has a better understanding. What is sabab in Arabic? When we say sabab, you say, well, reason, right? Be sabab, be something, because of something. Be cause. You say sabab means a cause, right? No, that's not correct. Sabab in Arabic, what does it mean? It means a rope. When we tie two things together, we often ascribe causation to the two things. When two things are tied together, then one thing pulls the other or seems to cause the other to happen. When in reality, it is just simply an association. So did Ka'b ibn Ujra cause Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to say something? Did Ka'b ibn Ujra change the Quran? No. But rather, that was already said in pre-eternity, and that was the time and place when this thing was revealed. It wasn't revealed because of Ka'b ibn Ujra. Ka'b ibn Ujra did not define the Quran or shape the Quran. Rather, it was revealed, applies to him specifically, and it applies to everybody based on the general meaning. Second. Okay, so there is a specific event that happens, a specific time, place, but the point is the general principle that we get from the Quran. Okay, there's a specific time, a specific person, a specific thing that happens, and yes, there are verses of the Quran that are clearly specific. They mention a particular person, Tabbat yada abi lahabin wa tab. Okay, we're talking about Abu Lahab specifically, and it applies by analogy to everybody else. But most of the time in the Quran, we find verses revealed at specific times or events, and the point is the general principle and not the specific event. The specific event is simply the occasion or time or place when that thing was revealed, but there's no in no means limit to that thing. Okay, and so some major works on Asbab al-Nuzul. Ali al-Madini, the Sheikh of Bukhari, he has a work on Asbab al-Nuzul, but it's not printed. And I don't even know if it's still extant, right? But it was a work written on that. Asbab al-Nuzul, Sheikh al-Bukhari. Number 2, Asbab al-Nuzul by Al-Wahidi. So Al-Wahidi is a muhaddith and a historian, and he has a whole work on Asbab al-Nuzul. I believe it's translated on altafsir.com. I believe you can look at it on altafsir.com. One of my friends, altafsir.com. I'm pretty sure it's there translated into English. That's how it's written, at-tafsir, I think with double E. And then there is Al-Ujab fi Bayan al-Asbab by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the great muhaddith and commentator in Bukhari Fath al-Bari. He has a work on it, but it's not completed. It's not completed. And then Imam al-Suyuti, the great mujtahid Imam al-Suyuti has a book called Lubab al-Nuqul, where he works with Asbab al-Nuzul. It's about this size, not that big, where he kind of generally put everything together. Now, the issue with is Ibn Hajar's work is not complete. That's one of the problems with it. And the issue with Lubab al-Nuqul is it's kind of it's not really Imam Suyuti in general. He is an encyclopedic scholar, right? And so some scholars, when they're working on a certain thing, they work in a critical way, and some are just simply gathering things, right? And all of these things are useful if you're doing research and trying to find quotes, references. It's very, very useful. So Suyuti, in many of his works, he will quote things that we have no access to whatsoever anymore. Many of his works in grammar, many of his works in hadith, etc. So he's with his just a very, very wide reading, he has access to things that we didn't have access to now, and he has manuscripts that we don't have manuscripts today. He was about 500 years ago, and so it's very useful. But a lot of the hadiths are weak, right? So it helps get the picture, but a lot of the hadith in there that are weak, that this happened because of that, is weak. Many things are weak. There's no proper editing, meaning it's no critical. So Suyuti is not giving us a critique of what's going on. He's just gathering, right? Which is not a problem. That's not a problem, but it is a consideration when reading it. So if you were to read it, and the same thing with Al-Wahidi, is it all authentic? Not necessarily, right? So I believe it is a mistake. It is a mistake that today somebody should print a mushaf for the general public to read, and then to put in the margins Asbab al-Nuzul by Al-Wahidi. Why is that a mistake? Because this is not a book for a layman to read. This is a book for a scholar to critique. And so if I'm just the average Joe in the mosque and I'm sitting there, I'm like, oh, what is this verse about? And it says, oh, Wahidi says this, and I have no ability to critique that. I don't know what the change in information is. I don't know. That's not good, right? And so we don't restrict knowledge. Everybody has access to knowledge. There's no books that are hidden, no manuscripts are hidden from anybody. But at the same time, the responsibility of the scholars is to provide useful material to the layman, right? And so it's not very useful if you give me something that I can't understand or I can't critique, and it needs critiquing. So there's a lot of material out there, but you need to tread through it carefully and edit it properly. Just like anything in reality, any raw material has to be edited. So a few notes. So we have basically, we find many hadiths where there'll be this happened because of this, or the Sahabi says this happened because of that, or Tabi'i said this happened because of this, etc. We'll have various verses. By no means all verses will be conjoined with some kind of quote, some kind of reference. This was revealed concerning X, it was revealed concerning Y. Now, in reality, the Sahaba radiallahu anhum didn't seem to have a concept of the reason of revelation in reality. They didn't have that idea that we might have in our mind is this verse was revealed concerning this. What do they have in their head? What do they have in their head? Is that there is a sabab, that there is a connection between this verse and that person. There is a connection between this event and that verse. Was that verse actually, was it revealed at that time? Not necessarily. But what they're saying is, I, as a Sahabi, saw a connection between this verse and that person, this verse and that event. So the problem is, you might say this thing was revealed concerning this. It didn't actually come at that time, but rather it was observable there was that connection. And so number one, you're relying on the ijtihad, the insight and the observation of the Sahabi. Number two, the Sahaba didn't think necessarily like that. They didn't have the idea that this is limited to this, but rather it applies to it, right? So it is not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is making up the Quran, or the Prophet is making up the Quran based on what is happening around them. That's not what is happening. But rather, Quran is being revealed and the Sahaba are noticing connections, sometimes very clear connections, sometimes more abstract connections. Okay, another observable thing, is that clear, Atif? Is that clear, Atif? So what I'm saying is, imagine, for example, you work for a manager, Atif, okay, and this manager says, okay, henceforth, everybody's got to be working from the office. Okay, and you just realized that he came off the phone with somebody saying, I'm still not going to come to the office because the numbers of corona are still high. So you, in your mind, you think that because he just came off that phone, he's coming to that decision. So you're like, yeah, he just spoke to Jack and Jack said this, so he got a bit ticked off, so he changed the rules. But the rule was already there. He sent the email before he was on the phone. So you see a connection between his conversation with Jack and the decision that was made, and you say, oh, this happened because of this, but it didn't actually happen because of those things. And so you're telling me what happens later on. You're like, oh, this happened because of this. It was in relation to that. That wasn't the cause of it, right? And so therefore, we shouldn't come on and restrict the text and say the text only applies to that scenario, this scenario. That's not necessarily the case at all. Is that clear, Altif? Okay. Other notes, what do we say? There are, so it says that the asbab and nuzul, the scenarios where we have a verse being explained, this happened because of this, that happened that, are far more in the Medinan verses than the Meccan verses. Why do you think that would be the case, Altif? Given some of the differences between the Medinan and Meccan verses, Why do you think there would be more scenarios where we say this happened because of this than in the Medinan verses versus the Meccan verses? Yes, Saltif, yeah. So why do you think there will be more instances where Sahaba or Tabi'een are explaining why this verse was revealed for a Medinan verse and not for a Meccan verse? Why do you think? So let's just remind ourselves of some of the differences. Muslims are not always around, true. Some of the differences. Do we find much halal and haram in Meccan surahs? Do we find specific, for example, rulings of details of halal haram? Do you find much of that in Meccan rulings, in Meccan surahs? Do you find, for example, a verse of cutting someone's hand off? Right, exactly. So generally, the rules came in Medina period. So wouldn't it be interesting for you? Imagine you're living a generation after the Prophet ﷺ, and you're like, oh, Ibn Abbas, when did the first verse of cutting someone's hand off come? When did that come? And he says, oh, it happened so and so, my uncle actually, or so and so, my neighbor. This happened. So, oh, that's cool. I didn't realize that. So the details. But as for Al-Qari'ah, why would Al-Qari'ah is like, that's about Yawm Al-Qiyamah. So, does there have to be a particular reason? Like, you wouldn't even ask that question, such that it should be narrated, oh yeah, Qari'ah was narrated when this thing happened. Like, it's not really, so specific scenarios, a person of somebody swearing that they're never going to sleep with their wife, particular scenario comes up. This thing happened, this man said this to his wife, and da 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 da. A story happened, and here's the verses of the Quran. So you'd be like, oh, what happened? Right? Whereas, Al-Duha, maybe. For example, when did Surah Al-Duha, was it revealed? This had happened or that had happened. Why does it say, was it? مَا وَدَّعَكَ رَبُّكَ وَمَا قَلَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, your Lord has not left you, nor is he angry with you. So, well, you might ask, why did that happen? Then you find out it happened because of this happened or that, etc. What was the event? But usually, in the Medinan verses, there's more general things, and in the Meccan surahs, there's more general points, and in the Medinan things, there's generally more specific points. So, because there's more specific points, there are going to be more explanations of why that was revealed. Right? Good. Most weak and sound narrations are from Ibn Abbas. So most Ibn Abbas and his students, it was a major powerhouse for tafsir, right? Like, do we have much tafsir coming out of Medina? I don't think so. But Mecca and Kufa was very significant for mufassirin, people explaining the Quran. So Ibn Abbas, there's lots of quotes from Ibn Abbas explaining the Quran, saying this happened for this reason, this happened for this reason. Right? It's also part of this, the attitude of Ibn Abbas. Ibn Abbas had a very introspective kind of way of looking at things. This happened, why, right? As opposed to it happened, it's just like that. That's how he's kind of meant. That's how he was as a faqih, as he was a mufassir. Why? Explaining why things happened. Right? There are many weak narrations. Now, is that a surprise anyway? Is that a surprise anyway? Are there many weak hadiths, full stop? Can we just say in general there are many weak hadiths in the world? Right? So in general, because it is hard for a hadith to be sahih, there are more weak hadiths than there are sahih hadiths. Okay? So then when you say there are many weak narrations about why a verse was revealed to you, well, that makes a lot of sense because, yeah, I mean, you're going to have more weak than strong, right? That's just normal. You're going to have some quote, and this has a gap in the chain, that has a gap in the chain, so it's going to be weak. So what it means then is that when you're looking through them, you're going to have to wade through a lot of information that may or may not be useful, right? It may or may not be useful because it might just be very weak, or, you know. we're not saying that a weak narration is not useful, just saying it may not be useful, right? So many narrations, even if they have a sound chain, do not make sense. This is a very important thing. They don't really add up. It just seems like that's not really like this happened because of this. Like, really? That doesn't really seem to add up with the surah. The surah seems to be talking about one thing, and then you say, oh, this happened because of this. You say, yeah, maybe, I mean, maybe it can apply to that, right? Maybe it can apply to that, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَا تُلْقُوا بِأَيْدِيكُمْ إِلَى التَّهْلُكَةِ. Do not kill yourselves. What is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talking about? Is don't destroy yourselves by not supporting the jihad. Okay, so then you say this verse was revealed concerning a Sahabi who made tayammum instead of making ghusl because he was scared of getting sick. So what's that got to do with what you're talking about? Nothing. So rather than saying that this was the reason for this verse to be revealed, we would rather say that it's simply applied indirectly or by extension to that person, right? Slightly different, right? There's a difference between the Sahabi seeing how this can apply to another scenario based on the general thing and saying it was about this, right? Okay, does that make sense? It makes sense, Atif? Okay. So we have to, when we're reading the Quran, we have to prioritize the book itself, prioritize the context itself, right? And this is an approach of my teacher, Sheikh Ali Hani, and his teacher, Dr. Fadl Abbas, is that yes, we don't ignore that. If there's a hadith about a verse of the Quran or a Sahabi saying something, it's very useful, it's very relevant, but we cannot give the absolute authority and what's it called, kind of like veto to that thing, because it might be just talking about the general side of that verse, but it's not actually the meaning of the verse, right? So saying that this verse can also be applied to this scenario and that scenario in the process, and then explains that, you know, haven't you read this verse which applies to that as well? True, that's useful, but that's not what the verse means. There's a difference between what the verse means and how the verse could also be applied, right? And so sometimes you might find see a hadith or might see a quote of Sahaba or Tabi'in saying this verse was revealed this or this happened, and doesn't really seem to fit in what we're talking about, right? And it's because it's just simply a more general application of it. It's not actually the meaning of that verse, right? And so obviously it is useful. So Al-Wahidi, he says this: a verse cannot be accurately explained without looking first at its story. Right? This obviously just makes a lot of sense. You know, why was this verse revealed? Obviously, it's going to help us understand what's going on. Right? So it is a useful thing. It's not a useless experiment, right? But it's just we have to do it carefully, and we don't say, "Oh, what does this mean? It was revealed concerning X. Oh, that's what it means then." That's not really fair. Even Taqiq al-Eid, one of the great mujtahid imams, or late mujtahid imams, a teacher of Imam al-Dhahabi, was a student. 1 second. The teacher of Imam al-Dhahabi, he says, explaining why, when a verse was revealed is a good way to understand the meanings of the Quran. Notice he called it a good way. It's a good means. It's not the means, but it's a good means. Right? So, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do not ever think that those who rejoice in that which they have done and love to be praised for that which they have not done, never think they are safe from the punishment. Okay, so notice this is a general principle. This applies in its generality. Never think that those who rejoice, absent in absolute sense, in that which they have done, right, and love to be praised for that which they have not done, never think they are saved from the punishment. Full stop. Believer or disbeliever, it doesn't say, it just talks about it in its general sense. Now or then, this person, that person in general, right? So that applies in general sense. So in Sahih Bukhari, Abu Sa'id al-Khudri mentions this applies to the hypocrites, the munafiqeen. So these are believers or people who are claiming to believers in Medina, but they're not really believers. Also in Bukhari, Ibn Abbas, he said that the Jews were hiding something. This refers to the Jews who were hiding something. So you can notice that you say, well, who's right? Say, well, maybe both of them are right, because it's just the general application of it. So Ibn Abbas had this thing in his head, the verse was revealed, like, you guys have been spoken about here. But it's not really specific to them. It's more, it applies in its generality to them, but it's not specific to them. And it applies in its generality to another Sahaba, but it's not specific to them. Okay? And so some modern abuses, we come along, we read these books on Asbab al-Nuzul and say, look how the Quran is trapped in time, is limited to a specific scenario. It's just this. And this comes from two camps. This comes from one camp, which is, we want hadith. Give me something that's with a chain transmission. Forget your own opinion, right? We want hadith and, we want revelation. We don't want like your own interpretation. So trying to be too focused on, too conservative. Like if they give me a hadith, then it's sound. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. Too much emphasis on this is dangerous. Similarly, it comes from another camp of people who want to try and limit the Quran culturally and historically. They're like, yeah, everything in the Quran applies to Arabia 1,400 years ago. Because it's speaking about this scenario, not talking about my life. It's speaking that scenario, not talking about my life. Interest, for example, that applies to what was happening then at their time. Hijab is then at their time. Marriage, everything's culturally and historically and economically relative, meaning it doesn't apply to me. Whereas if we look in the Quran in its general language, it's not culturally, historically, economically specific. It's general, right? And so the proper approach is to take into consideration when it was revealed, why it was revealed. It's useful, but to understand it in its general sense, because the words are general, right? As Imam Shafi'i says, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Ahallallahu al-bay'a wa harrama al-riba," Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made financial transactions halal and has made interest haram. What does financial transactions mean? It means that verse in its generality applies to every single financial transaction there is and ever will be. And then we are then starting to exclude certain financial transactions from that by other principles in the Sharia. But otherwise, that statement, Ahallallahu al-bay'a, Allah has made financial transactions halal. That means all financial transactions are halal. Unless forbidden by other texts in the Quran or Sunnah. Right? It is actually inclusive of every single thing we do today and everything in the future and everything that happened in the past. It is inclusive of these things. The generality of the language is inclusive. Inna as-salata kanat 'ala al-mu'minina kitaban mawquta. Indeed, the prayer was and ever will be obligatory on the believers, not the believers at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the believers in general, every believer from now until the Yawm al-Qiyamah, and every single prayer, every single time. Right? It's not specific to a place, a specific time. The language is general, so it's general. If the language is specific, then it's specific. And that's why when we study usul al-fiqh, we study the science of interpreting sacred text. We study, what's the first chapter? Mabahith al-alfadh, dealing with language. What kind of language is being used? Extremely important. Okay. So again, which two camps would be interesting to limit this? Camps who are saying, give me a hadith. I don't want your opinion, I want a hadith. So they find a hadith and you try and limit them. Then it becomes, it's only about what's comes in a hadith. Right? Or it's only what comes from Ibn Abbas, only what comes from the Sahaba Tabi'in. Right? Which is not really fair. Because sometimes you can understand the verse in its general sense in other ways. It's not necessarily only limited to that. Not that we're going to go against them. We're just saying it's not so limited to that. Right? And then other people, another camp, modernists, certain modernists would be trying to limit and restrict and put the Quran in a purely historical, limited to a purely historical or economic or political or cultural reality that was happening then that doesn't apply today, right? Like many Christians, when they read the Old Testament, they're like, oh yeah, that's an old, this doesn't apply to us. That's a different world. Read the New Testament and Jesus says this, Jesus says that. The point is the moral lessons and that's it. The details don't apply to us. Right? That's a way of thinking. That's a very common way of thinking, but that's a wrong way of thinking. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking to you and he uses general terms, it is general. And if he uses specific terms, it is specific. If something is specific and restricted to 1,400 years ago, not a problem. But if it's not, then it still applies to you. You are still being spoken to and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is still addressing you. Right? Does that make sense? Didn't he use the verse that justifies? Sorry, I must. Correct. Yeah. So the point is applying something in its generality, but that's not actually what the verse means. Right, there's two different things. Okay. So going on to the Sunan, we've spoken about this before, but I want to talk about it again. The importance of the Sunan and importance of understanding that. So when we pick up the Sunan Abu Dawood, Sunan al-Nasa'i, Sunan Tirmidhi, Sunan Ibn Majah, and there's many other Sunan. Sunan al-Darimi, the Muntakha Ibn Jarud, who else? There's many Sunan. When we pick up these books, what do we see? We see halal and haram. We mentioned this before. We see halal and haram. Okay? And I'm just going to read briefly. We'll share this with you as well. Where is this? Abu Dawood introducing his book to the people of Mecca. Okay. Can you see the text? Is it clear? Sorry, can you see it now? Okay. So he says, peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum. Indeed, I extol and praise Allah. This is Imam Abu Dawood in the end of the 3rd century, maybe 270, something like that. 260, 270, writing to the scholars of Mecca about his book. So Abu Dawood, he's from Sijistan in Iran, but he spent a lot of time in Baghdad and in northern Turkey and other places. A student of Imam Ahmad. He says, praise Allah to you, the one whom there is no deity worthy of worship except for him. And I ask him to send salah on Prophet ﷺ and his slave and messenger. May Allah send blessings and peace upon him whenever he is mentioned. As to what precedes, may Allah grant us a pardon which is not accompanied by anything displeasing, and after which there shall be no punishment. Indeed, you asked me to discuss the hadiths in Kitab al-Sunan, whether they are the most sahih of what I know concerning each topic, and I came upon all of which you mentioned. So know that there is that it is the case. Know that is the case, except if I should have related from two sahih routes, one of them having a higher chain while the narrator of the other is strong in accuracy. So I occasionally would write that. And I do not see in my book even 10 hadiths that are like this. So he says, basically, when you talk about a chapter when you talk about something in Sunan Ibn Abu Dawood, do you mention the most authentic hadith or not? He says, well, actually, there's some technicalities. Sometimes based on a shorter chain and a more accuracy, I mentioned two different things. And so that sometimes happens. Not a big deal. He says, in reality, I only write 1 or 2 hadiths concerning each topic. So what does that mean? That means a book like Sunan Abu Dawood, which is about 5,000 hadiths, something like that, maybe 6. He's only doing 1 or 2 hadiths on each topic because he said, otherwise it'd be too big. So that means there's lots more to read. Even if there were a number of Sahih hadiths concerning the topics, I'm not going to write every single one. for there would be too many, and my intent was to make it the book easy to benefit from. And when I repeated a hadith in any chapter from 2 or 3 routes, different chains that I might have, it is only due to additional speech contained. Perhaps it contains one additional word not in other hadiths. And occasionally I summarize a long hadith, for if I were to write it completely, some of those who heard it would not understand the place of fiqh in it. So I summarize it. So I'm just trying to get a hadith. The whole thing is there. I just cut a little piece out of it and give it to you, so you understand what's being said. Okay. It says, as for mursal hadiths, so type of weak hadiths, then the scholars of the past, such as Sufyan al-Thawri, Malik ibn Anas, al-Awza'i, used to use them as proof until Ash-Shafi'i radiallahu anhu came and criticized them, and Imam Ahmad and others followed him in that. So when there is no authentic hadith ascribed to the Prophet ﷺ in opposition to the mursal hadith, and there is no sound hadith to be found, then the mursal hadith is used as a proof, but it is not like the muttasil in strength. Right? And it doesn't have the rest of it there. And so what he's saying is basically I'm organizing each chapter according to what's good or acceptable, right? And so if there is no sound hadith, then the weak hadith will take its place. Basically, that's what he's saying. So this is very important because it's very different to Bukhari and Muslim, right? It's very different to Bukhari and Muslim, because Bukhari and Muslim, they're not trying to do books on halal and haram. They're trying to do books on sahih. It's different. Where are we? And so it's very important to understand that weak hadiths or borderline hadiths are relevant when dealing with halal and haram. So Abu Dawood is a good example of that. So he says anything that's extremely weak, he'll say here's a problem with this hadith. Otherwise, it's salih, it's okay. So okay, relevant, useful, worth reading, worth thinking about when dealing with halal and haram is from possibly weak up to acceptable up to sahih. Right now, so that's Abu Dawood. Abu Dawood, he mentions as well, another part of his introduction, that he says that basically, if you read my book, you've got a pretty good idea about halal and haram, right? You obviously have to study with the faqih to see what the actual meaning of the hadiths are. There's something else. The point is the content is a pretty good overview of what the Prophet spoke about in terms of halal and haram. Right? It's pretty good. Now, Sunan al-Nasa'i is on a slightly higher level. Sunan al-Nasa'i is on a slightly higher level. And Sunan al-Nasa'i as well is in reality has two sunan. He has the Mujtaba and the Kubra. So the Mujtaba is again about 5,000 hadith, something like that. And it is a abridged work of the Sunan al-Kubra, which is about 11,000 hadith, the Kubra. Now what's nice about Nasa'i is Nasa'i does a lot of criticism. There's a lot of criticism. He shows you what's going on a lot of the time. Okay? And he will often show you what's going on, where the mistake is. He does that in a number of his books. So number one, Nasa'i is a major hadith critic. We have lots of information from Nasa'i about hadith narrators. It's very, very common. Look up any hadith narrator, Nasa'i has something to say about him. Abu Dawood sometime, but not as much as Nasa'i. Nasa'i is one of the key hadith critics. He also showing you his work, generally speaking. He says, listen, can you see that this chain is like this, and like this, and like this? Can you see where the mistake is? Now, he doesn't necessarily spell it out, just the style of how they used to work. They don't really spell it out because they're kind of specialists talking to specialists. But it is there. If you read the book carefully, you can see he's pointing out errors, right? Way more than Abu Dawood, right? Way more than Abu Dawood. And so in terms of learning the science of hadith criticism, you see much more with Nasa'i. Much more with Nasa'i. Okay? But again, will you find weak hadiths in Nasa'i? Yes. Right? Because again, he's doing the same kind of thing. He's talking about halal and haram. He is a Shafi'i scholar. And he's talking about halal and haram. And he's organizing the hadiths in a way for you to see the halal and haram. And part of the discussion of halal and haram are weak hadiths and mursal hadiths. Okay? So to give an example that we mentioned before, I believe, is does it break your wudu if you touch your wife? So there is no chapter on that in Bukhari or Muslim. Why? Is it because Bukhari and Muslim don't care about that issue in fiqh, whether or not it breaks your wudu? No. It's because there's no Sahih Hadith on it. So as a fiqh discussion, Bukhari and Muslim are deficient because they're just not there. Okay, but there might be a hadith that's weak or possibly weak that is relevant on that discussion, so it's going to be there, right? And so as a complete fiqh picture, the Sunan Abi Dawud, Nasa'i, Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah are much more useful. Arguably the most useful book is the Jami' of Tirmidhi. The Jami' of Tirmidhi. Why? Because Tirmidhi, he's not doing as a, let's say, as more of a layman. It's not super layman book, but it was more a layman. He ranks every single hadith. So he says this hadith is sahih, this hadith is hasan, this hadith is da'if. He tells you. None of the other books do that. Nasa'i might show you what the problem is on a certain level. Abu Dawud kind of, but Tirmidhi is there, number one. Number two, Tirmidhi also tells you what do the fuqaha say about this hadith. So he quotes a hadith on the Prophet ﷺ praying Taraweeh and then stopping and going home. So what do the fuqaha say about that? Then he mentions what the fuqaha say. And he's quoting Al-Awza'i and he's quoting Ash-Shafi'i and he's quoting Malik and quoting all these people. It's extremely useful work. Extremely useful work. It's makshuf. It's exposed. It's accessible, readable. Right? Now you can't give fatwa from it because there's still more to research, but it's still extremely useful book. It's one of the most useful books out there. Right? And also, one of the nice things about Tirmidhi is it's not really a sunan, it's kind of a sunan, but it's also a jami'. It has other topics that aren't in Nasa'i and Abu Dawud. So it's extremely useful work, extremely useful work. Right? If you were to read one of the 6 books, that would be the book to read. Right? If you were to read one of the 6 books from cover to cover, Tirmidhi would be the book to read. Not Nasa'i, because Nasa'i, you need to, what did I used to do when I was in Jordan? I had all my books, and I came recently to America. Every other day or every day, if I could, I go through a hadith in Nasa'i and go through, and I'd get out the research works and pull out who the narrators are and who's narrating from who and what's going on, right? Because it's a hadith, it's a book for hadith critics, Nasa'i, right? Tirmidhi is much more accessible. Much more, it's more, he gives you more. He tells you what the problem is. So-and-so is weak, and this hadith is weak, etc. Okay? Albeit he is mutasahil. His bar is low. So what he deems sahih might be hasan. What he deems hasan might be da'if sometimes. His bar is low with Tirmidhi. That's the only kind of consideration. Otherwise, it's very useful work. And also, when he's quoting the mujtahid imams, it might not be the actual position. Because he is very early on, and the school hasn't been edited yet. And so he might be quoting Imam Malik, and that's not the Maliki school. He might be quoting Imam Shafi, and that's not the Shafi school. Okay. With Ibn Majah is very nice as well, very nicely organized. The issue with Ibn Majah is there's many more weak hadiths. In fact, there are some hadiths that generally, arguably, are fabricated in Ibn Majah. Now, he didn't fabricate them, but but they are. It's much weaker, right? So I am currently teaching Sunan Ibn Majah. Why am I doing Ibn Majah? As an exercise to pull out the weak hadiths. So you find more weak hadiths in Ibn Majah than you find in the other ones. So it's more fruitful in that as an experiment. Whereas if you're trying to do hadith criticism, here's hadith criticism. So I was doing a course I was doing a few months ago, which was Ilal al-Hadith criticism, based on Nasa'i's Amal al-Yawm al-Layla. He has a book on the Adhkar of the day and the night, and he does lots of i'lal there. He does lots of showing you what's going on, but it's tricky, right? That's for advanced students, right? It's for advanced students. Finding out what's going on and trying to map out what's going on is really hard, right? It's really hard. Whereas Tirmidhi, if you read one book in hadith in your life, one of the original books, the Ummahat al-Kutub, not a layman's book, but one more advanced, Tirmidhi would be your book. Because it gives you the picture of the fiqh, gives you the picture of what's the hadith and what's going on, everything. Generally speaking, These books are all academic books and not very useful unless you've studied a lot of hadith and fiqh anyway. So generally speaking, for the layman, you should deal with other books like Riyadh al-Salihin, right, by Imam Nawawi, like Targhib Tarhib al-Hafiz Mundhari, like the Muntaqa of Ibn Taymiyyah, for example. Books that deal with, it's more summarized, right? Because you don't really want to see a chain transmission because you don't know what to do with it. Who is that narrator? Who's this narrator? Unless you're trained. Okay. Any questions or queries? Any questions, Atif? Okay, inshallah. So I'll stop here. Subhanallah bihamdik ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Sallallahu alaihi wa sallam Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi. Jazakum khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.